Hello, and welcome to Research the News. I'm Ray, and today we're diving into the history of the Vice Presidency in the United States and how its role has evolved over the years. Joining me is my co-host Ben Hart, and together we're going to look at how the historical context can better help us understand its significance in today's political landscape. And as always, our mission here is to have open discussions as we search for some common ground. Let's get started. All right. Welcome, Ben. How you doing today?
Doing great, Ray. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to talk about vice presidents. And I think people are going to find out that this is a little more exciting than it sounds, even though the first vice president, John Adams, didn't seem overly excited about the vice presidency. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Ben?
He called it the most insignificant office that man has ever contrived, I think is what the...
Yeah, that's... I still... Have you ever seen the John Adams HBO series?
I have not, no.
I want to see it because I feel like Paul Giamatti saying that and having that kind of attitude about the vice presidency would be an interesting view to check out. But yeah, apparently when it got started, John Adams was not happy about being the vice president and felt pretty out about it. And what's interesting at that
Paul Giamatti, sorry, Paul Giamatti played John Adams in this?
Paul Giamatti played John Adams, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Like the most neurotic representation of John Adams I could think of.
I know, which is why I'd love to see this. This would be great. So I think maybe that can be all of our homework. Anyone listening to the podcast, we can all do a little study on the John Adams HBO series. So, but yeah, and that's back at that time. One of the interesting parts that a lot of people may not know about, because this happened, several hundred years ago, was that the vice president wasn't a running mate. It's not like today when you pick a running mate and you have the DNC or the RNC. The vice president was the person who finished second in the election, which, Ben, can you just, hearing that, if we still had that today, can you picture a Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton presidency?
It would just be a continuation of the debates. Or, there's the theory that they used to be friends.
Right.
Or they used to, the Clintons and they all used to be friends. But I wonder if they would be friends again or they would stay sort of bitter enemies through the end there.
Yeah, I think it's a great actual thought experiment, because one of the things, if you look at anyone who went against Donald Trump, he called their wives ugly. He said that they were terrible, stupid people, and now they're all like, wow, we love Donald Trump. And in the flip side, Kamala Harris was the one that went after Biden, I think, the hardest in the debates. And, she became the vice president. So it'd be really interesting to see Hillary Clinton out there singing the praises of Donald Trump. Or, okay, let's be honest, Donald Trump would have not gone up there and sang the praises of Joe Biden. But I think Hillary may have done it. She may have backed him up.
Yeah. She's a little more diplomatic. She may have done it. Hard to tell. I think there is that sort of like diplomatic deference. There's also the when we were talking about Vance's last episode of who was vehemently against Trump and outspoken about Trump, but then was like, well, I guess I got to suck up to the boss, and so then kind of turned his own tables. So who knows what Hillary would have done, but it's really interesting to think about the fact that was the precedent was first place and second place. Yeah. First place was president, second place was vice president. And I could see why they switched it. If we're going to talk a little more on history in the original, they switched it in a constitutional amendment because that was the original constitutional outline. But one thing that was in the Constitution, the original one, that was problematic was that, and something I touched on last time, was that the vice president can go into the Senate. If that's why you want to have a vice president who was a former senator, or not, that's why, but it's sometimes helpful because the vice president can be the tiebreaker. So it would be really problematic if you were one party president and the other party was vice president, and then they did a tiebreaker vote that was against your wishes. That's right. That's a pretty tough way to be. And so I could see why they changed it. It would be fascinating. I think and probably not alone in this. I think we've talked about it before. It would be interesting, idealistically, to have a ticket where you had running together two people from different parties, and one became president, one became vice president. But that's only, I think, if they ran together on the same ticket in some alternate dimension. Otherwise, it does make sense to have the VP be chosen or be in the same party as the president.
Yeah, I mean, the more I think about this, I actually look back at maybe some super historical pairings that may have turned out from this. And I mean, I'm even thinking recently, not even historically, I'm looking at a Barack Obama, Mitt Romney presidency, and that sounds interesting. That sounds, if Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were running now, that would be my vote, I think, for the president, no matter who was actually on the top of the ticket. I feel like between the two of them. So that would be really interesting. And I feel like that's going to anger a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, that comment. I can hear people now tuning out. But I think, I think they both have some interesting ideas and could maybe come together into something that actually have some good debates, conversation, and come up with some good ideas. So yeah, but I do think, like what you said, that is obviously a problem. And I think it's way more of a problem today. I think back then, these guys that are the founding fathers, they definitely had some differing ideas, but it seemed like they could actually have some real debates and real discussions and come to some solutions. I mean, they came up with the Constitution. So that's a pretty big thing. And today we can't come up with basically any bills because, as I think you mentioned last time, it's like the least productive Congress ever. So I think it had more hope back then, but it was rough. And like you said, so the historical roles, when we look at the Constitution, it's the tie breaking for the Senate. That's number one. So it's the presiding officer of the Senate. That comes from the Constitution itself. The succession to the presidency, which came from the Constitution and then was clarified in the 25th Amendment. And that just means that the president is first in line. And after they had the 25th Amendment, that was 1967, it clarified what happens if there's disabilities or, something going wrong with the president. You'll hear that now from both sides. When Trump was in office, people were calling for the 25th Amendment. Biden, same thing. And there's also the role in the Electoral College, which did change a little bit. The vice president oversees the counting of electoral votes during the joint session of Congress. And the 12th Amendment came and clarified what would happen if there was no candidate receiving a majority of the vote or if there was a tie. And I think that is something we can even talk about. We mentioned Mike Pence last time and the counting of the Electoral College votes. And I think that's something that got a lot of press in the media, but not a lot of people understood what that actual role was. And it's actually spelled out in the Constitution that vice president counts those votes. And past that, that's really it for the primary duties from the Constitution. Otherwise, it's an advisor, a diplomat, and that's all political more than anything else. So did I miss anything, Ben? Anything you want to add to that part?
I was going to put a fun fact. I was going to put a fun fact in there as the comic relief here. The 25th Amendment has been invoked a couple of times, but most recently due to both of George W. Bush's colonoscopies. So,
that is fun fact.
And also under Reagan too, there seems to be, really dire circumstances that the 25th Amendment was enacted and Dick Cheney was president for, I think, 6 hours or something like that. I can't remember, but
Dick Cheney.
There's your fun fact for the day.
I'm surprised we didn't have a bigger war when Dick Cheney became president for 6 hours.
So that's I think that is you touched on something that's interesting about what you were saying, as traditionally the role of the VP was pretty a nothing sandwich, like to John Adams' quote, to where it became more and more influential over the years. And why I think I wanted, when we were talking, hey, what are we going to do next episode? That's why I wanted to touch on this, because maybe it's like where we are in terms of our understanding and view of the different presidential elections historically. But like this VP pick, besides maybe like Sarah Palin that I can think of in history, was like a big deal. Like this seems to me like the biggest deal of VP pick that I can remember in our lifetime. So unless you can think of anybody else, like George Bush under Reagan was it seemed like it was And obviously we were very young then, but it seemed like an obvious because he had served in government for a long time. Clinton, Gore just a lot of times the VP was sort of the punchline.
Yeah.
Including
Dan
Biden
Quayle.
under Obama.
Yeah.
Dan Quayle. Like that's what made me think of Gore, Dan Quayle, especially. But even Biden was sort of like, I was having that conversation with a friend who had listened to the podcast, and we were kind of going back and forth on it, because one thing that I think that I'll lay out there is that because I work in sort of I consult on marketing for like Fortune 500s during the day, right? And so I come from a lot of this stuff from a marketing perspective. Mm-hmm. Not that I think it's the right perspective, but I think it's the dominant perspective. And so like the optics and the narrative and things like that. Whereas like, and I think you come from it as more of like, all right, this is the actual, and not that I don't agree that this is the right way, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like, okay, these are the actual like platform. This is what it would do for the platform. This is what it would do for the legalities of it and the way that they would operate versus like my view of the VP. And a lot of this is like, it's just marketing, sadly. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I felt like this VP pick was especially optics focused, because there's a certain marketing aspect of it too. You're trying to like appeal to everybody, and how do you do that with your VP picks? So I kind of got off on the side tangent there, but just to sort of frame why we're actually focused on the VP is because I think the news has really been focused on the VP for several reasons, but.
Well, yeah, and I think to me, the VP picks this time mattered a lot more because, especially when Biden was running, you had two people in their 80s that were both going to be the oldest presidents ever. And I don't know if anyone really was like, okay, they're definitely going to get through this next term. I will agree, though, that typically I'm looking at it more from a policy perspective, but I think that policy perspective also ties in with the marketing side of it. And I think both these picks, because last time Kamala hadn't picked her vice president yet, now we have Tim Walz.
Right.
And I think they were both very poor choices from garnering the support, because I think with Trump, I think he was riding high on the post-assassination surge, and he was going against Biden. They had that debate. It was just, I feel like he got cocky and said, yeah, I'm going to pick JD Vance. Like, I like the guy, I'm going to pick him. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to try to open up new avenues. I'm going to win this. And then Kamala came along, and it's been pretty interesting to see her distance herself from her progressive side. And even though her voting history shows that she was pretty progressive, very progressive, and now she's saying that she's a cop and a prosecutor and leaning away from that. And I was like, okay, so she's probably going to pick someone who's lining up more with that. And then she picks Tim Walz, who's one of the most progressive governors in the entire country. And it was I think both of them, I think, were poor choices. But back to your point, I think the significance, I think we always overstate that. I did look up some studies, and when you look at the history of how these things actually affect the presidency, they're not much. There was a UC Irvine study in 2010 that analyzed the presidential elections from 1968 to 2008 and found the net impact of shifting votes was less than 1%, which can still be a big deal in certain areas, but it's still 1%. And then
when was the study? Sorry.
It was 2010, but it analyzed data from 1968 to 2008. And then there was one that came out in 2016 about the home state advantage, because that was my next question was, okay, but what about people like, I think Josh Shapiro would have been a great choice for Kamala Harris, especially after hearing him at the rally after he wasn't selected. He was just so much better than anyone else on that stage. And I thought, okay, and he would have helped with Pennsylvania. And they found there was a big study we're going to link to on the website. I'm not going to bore everyone with it, but even that has been kind of overhyped, because still it's like, okay, the VP, I might know that person. They may have some ties to me. But they looked back even to Lyndon Johnson's selection, which they said helped Kennedy win Texas, and they pretty much debunked that. So you can look at the studies. Everyone has a different perspective. But to me, I'm saying I kind of agree on a gut level that 1% or less is actually the VP choice. And I think Kamala's choice matters less this time, but Trump's choice, I think, will actually end up hurting him a little bit more this time, because Kamala is young enough that they're not looking towards the next president.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, right? That's why I asked you when that study was done, because I feel like really since Obama that has mattered more than it used to, the VP pick. So like I think back in the day, it was like, again, even back to Mondale was like Saturday Night Live. If you watch old episodes of Saturday Night Live, was like, again, he was the punching bag or, the punchline. But I think Obama was really the first one, and he was elected 08, right? So was the first one where the VP pick seemed to make a difference. And I think that was because, again, we're pretty open about everything on the show. So because he was black, I think that there was a certain, like, we need to pick someone who is known, like, and Biden had been there forever. He's sort of this everyman kind of guy to shore up optically. I'm always going to use the word optics because it's the marketing thing, right? Mm-hmm. Of, hey, this guy sort of advocates for he's cool with this guy, so we're cool with him. And I think that is debatable. I think that obviously the percentage of vote that went towards Obama, to your point, was probably negligible, the difference that Biden made. But I think now that because votes are getting, the voting tally is getting smaller and smaller, who the percentage goes to, that it does tip the scales just enough. And I think for this one especially, the common factor between Trump and Harris's pick was they were both appeals to sort of middle America, right? Like Vance comes from the Rust Belt. He writes this book about being, like we were saying last time, like the voice of Appalachia. And then you've got Walz, who's coming from, Minnesota, who is this like down home coach, teacher kind of guy. So if I know we were talking about doing this, that we'll start doing predictions, like, and be like, have our tally of predictions. We both got right. We obviously did not get the VP pick right last time. Not at all. Two things that we did, you were like, you can never tell. It's not going to be who you think. That was correct. The one that I did was close. It's going to have to be a straight white family man. I said from the South, but it ended up being from the Midwest, and it ended up being a straight white family man. Yeah. So I think that those predictions, that was in the ballpark. Walz came out of nowhere. I don't think anyone was predicting him. And
can I this is
our last episode. Yeah.
I think Walz, one of the things that's interesting to me is that he is looks like the family man, but he also looks like he's a great grandfather or a grandfather. There's just something about him. He does look much older than I thought, because when I heard about him, I was like, oh, he looks like a nice old man. And I was like, oh, he's 60. That's not,
he's 2 years, he's like 2 years older than Harris, right?
It's like, I was like, wow, that's interesting. So but no, I agree with you.
Some people age better than others. That's all there is to that. Yeah.
I mean, he seems like a jolly man, but again, politically, I think there's a lot of things I disagree with, but I think you did hit it in the head with the fact that what you did need to find that kind of persona. And I think when you're going back to like marketing terms and
good word.
Research studies, you find personas. And I think that's a lot of times what happens with VP picks now. And back to your point about Biden, I don't disagree that as a VP, he was a good choice. I just think that there's a lot of people you could have slotted in there that would have brought that same persona. So I think that's where, to me, like, I never thought about that before, just this conversation, but I see it now as these personas that we have to have, and we find some VP candidate that kind of matches up with that. And as long as you don't go too far out of it, like Sarah Palin, they were trying to find someone who would energize the base because McCain was old and she was a woman and governor, and she it turns out she was a little bit crazy. So that kind of she broke out of the persona they were hoping for.
Yeah. Those are all great points, and thank you for using the word persona. Yeah, that's like what would I say? Like foundational level marketing term. Of just like, we have this person who sort of fits this mold. If we want to explain it to the listeners / viewers, right? It's just a basic archetype of a person that fits this mold. They're within this age range, look like this income level, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the interesting thing with Walz, though, is like, that was interesting for me is that someone said he looks like he should be a Trump voter, but he's like the opposite of he's like a gun-owning old white guy, right? Like that's really interesting. I was like, in terms of personas, I didn't know that those guys existed, to be frank.
Yeah.
Like I was like, okay, everyone who's like Democrat and progressive is sort of young and, or, you know, not an old white guy who owns guns. Like that was like really, really sobering. And it gave me a little bit of like a, oh yeah, don't think you got everybody figured out.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't have purple hair, so how would you have known, Ben? That's
I know.
It's crazy.
Is it blue or purple?
Yes. He was just blending into the background there. But yeah, I mean, I think both these picks, though, I think that's one of the things that still over time, and we look back at Kamala Harris, I mean, let's talking about the historical role of the vice president.
Yeah.
She has presided over Congress, but honestly, I assumed when Biden got elected, this would be the Biden-Harris show. And I didn't hear much about Harris at all. And it was really kind of shocking to me because I was surprised that they didn't put her out more and have more of the PR, have more of the speeches, because I assumed they were, getting her ready for either 2024 or 2028. And really the only thing that she was responsible for on a large scale was the border czar of Mexico and the U.S. And at the time, that was a pretty common term. And then obviously, apparently she wasn't. We can debate that, but looking back at some of the actual facts, I think it was funny to me. For those listeners who don't know the background here, Kamala was mentioned as the border czar. Biden put her up as someone who was going to manage that. She was going to deal with some systemic issues. That's what she said, that we're going to help solve the border issue and work with immigration. And even a statement from the White House literally used the term border czar. And then once that started being an attack against her, the media kind of came out and said, no, she wasn't the border czar. And it really became a whole battle of what words were used. And I think they kind of gave up on it because they realized she really was kind of put in charge of the border at one point. But that right there is still ceremonial. There's nothing really where she was, there's not a border czar title. It's a position. It's just a title that was given to her to say, hey, you're in charge of this. But past that, I really didn't see her much at all. And I was pretty shocked by that. What's your take on why we didn't see more of Kamala Harris over the first 3.5 years until she became the candidate?
Yeah, great question. And as you were saying it, my first thought was the media was so focused on just Biden being old. Like, the only thing I can really think about, and the thing is, like, a quick aside on that, Biden was actually an extremely effective, he had an extremely effective 4 years. Like, there's a lot that happened in the past 4 years in terms of a president, whether that was his administration. We've had those conversations, offline about how much the administration was running it, how much, even the chief of staff runs in any presidential, office or whatever, runs the show. But I think for that especially so. So I think the media was just really focused on, it was still focused on Trump, and then Trump's like barbs or jabs at Biden being old, and then Biden looking and sounding old, where Harris just was in the background noise for the most part. And I don't know that I hear your point of it would have made a lot of sense for them. Hey, Biden's getting pretty old. He might, if he gets reelected, he might not make it through. He might not make it through this current presidency, right? But I can, every other vice president that I can think of, with the exception of maybe Dick Cheney, was definitely in the background, or Biden when he had a gaffe, right? When he was vice president over Obama. It was like, well, Biden said he was going to punch this guy or something like that.
Biden,
Yeah, right.
Good old Joe.
We're like, oh, Uncle Joe. Yeah. Exactly. So I don't know that she was treated any different than most other vice presidents, except for, like I said, Cheney, who was an exception, who, there was even jokes then that Cheney was the president and George Bush was just doing his bidding. But, and I didn't even really know that Harris was, to be frank, I didn't really know that Harris was like the border czar or border, point person, however you want to say that, past when it was brought up or before it was brought up in the news. So I don't know if you have any different theories on why that might be the case, but that's my 2 cents, Ray.
I hear you on the media focusing on Biden being old, but I think that was primarily the conservative media. that was one of the things that frustrated me when after that debate that went terribly for Biden, was everyone was like, oh no, this is terrible, Biden's old. And it's like, wait, I've been saying that for like 3 years, and not in a way where like, oh, Biden's old and he needs to get out of there and I can't stand him. It was like, I'm a little bit scared because this guy clearly has lost his full mental capacity. And I think so the liberal media, I don't think covered that as much as they probably should have. And it was
can I jump in real quick on that? It was sort of like being someone who's liberal leaning and we both have Democrat friends, but it was definitely one of those, like, we need to talk about grandpa situations that no one wanted to talk about. Like, it was, I mean, everybody was sort of quietly like, oh, Biden doesn't look so good. Like, I hope,
but
and
that's
then,
the thing that bothers me.
The State of the Union, where everyone's like, wait, I don't know who this
maybe he's alive.
New Adderall fueled Joe Biden is, but we'll take him, and then that was just a flash in the pan there but to your point, I think the liberal media definitely swept it under the rug. They were just like, we know that's a thing. We're not going to talk about it. We just, we don't want to bring it up, but yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the part that that's the part that frustrates me. I mean, people that are supporters of him sweeping under the rug, his staff, all of that, totally. I mean, I get it. Like, why wouldn't you sweep it under the rug? You're not going to go out there and be like, hey, let's attack him. But that's the thing that really bothers me about the media today from both sides here. When, Trump's on Fox, unless he's talking to Neil Cavuto, he doesn't get hard questions. And if you have any of the Democrats talking on CNN, it's given a pass. There's a few people that will, Jake Tapper, I think sometimes will go pretty hard at people. We don't need to go into specifics, but there are some in the media that will give hard questions. But generally, this is something that should have been pressed by the media for a very long time. And the only person doing it was Peter Doocy of Fox News. And then people who are liberal are like, well, I'm not going to listen to that because he's on Fox News. And so I think that, to me, was the biggest frustration with the whole Biden thing. But going back to the vice president and Kamala Harris, not only was I surprised because of the fact that I think there was a good chance she would take over, which was proven, but also she was the first woman. I mean, that's something that, as being the first woman vice president, I would have assumed the media would have been doing the glowing reviews that they're doing now on her for the last 3 years and talking about her achievements. But my theory behind this is that there's a lot of, I've talked to you about this before. I don't know people's motivations. I don't try to get into people's heads and say this is why they did what they did. I can guess, though. And with Kamala Harris, there's been a lot of stuff that have come out about her staff not liking her and being really tough to work for. And if you look at her actual turnover rate, that's pretty high. So the idea of and getting out of the behind the scenes stuff, when she was running for president, she dropped out with 0 votes and had 3% of the voting, the Democrats saying that they liked her. 3%. And then all of a sudden she became a VP. And at this point, it's like, she's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And that, to me, is, I just don't think she's not just from someone who doesn't necessarily agree with her politics, but from a general Democrat perspective, she wasn't very likable. And that's not, you just look at the actual polls and why she dropped out. She wasn't very likable then. And now she's likable because she's the star. It's the new Camelot. They're going to do all these glowing reviews of her because they want her to be president. But that's my theory. I just don't think she was a good face for the administration.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Turnover rate. I don't know that's a factor for sure. Trump has the highest turnover rate in presidential history in terms of cabinet members, and maybe not in history, but in recent history in terms of cabinet members. So
just to be clear here, Harris's staff turnover rate of nearly 92% surpasses President Biden's rate of 77 and former President Trump's rate of 72 during the first to fourth years of their term. So Trump wasn't even the most turnover in the last 2 presidents.
Interesting.
So just some live fact checking.
Yeah, that's
there.
A great correction.
Yeah. So
speaking of fact checking, I was also at the same time. But that's a great point. Well, my fact check was that she was never the border czar. She actually rejected that title several times. I have 2 sources from 2021 where Republicans of the conservative media were then trying to crown her border czar. And there's one from the Washington Post Republicans try to crown Harris the border czar. She rejects the title, and that was 2021. So I don't know that she ever was. She was definitely assigned to like go down and sort of do the shaking hands and kissing babies, and we're doing something about it. So
just to clarify on that, yeah, and this is a good point. Even when I was talking about it before, it's really the semantics of the word. If you tell me, Ben, I want you to go outside and pick up a baseball and hit it, and go do that on a field with 9 other people, maybe I don't want to call myself a baseball player, but in that moment, I'm a baseball player. And that's a terrible analogy. And you're going to find, if you're listening to the show for the first time or in the future, I'm probably going to come up with some terrible analogies. But I think it goes back to, in a simpler way, if it looks like a duck and it floats like a duck, it's a duck. And so I agree with you that official title of border czar, like I said, I think it's made up. But if you look at her duties, she talks about tackling the causes of immigration and some of the systemic issues and the whole shaking hands. I mean, that's the role of someone who's in charge of that. So I agree with you that the title border czar wasn't there. I think it just becomes an issue of semantics, whether the way it's being presented is not only was she not a border czar, but she had nothing to do with the border. That's often what comes out. And I agree with you too, just to be clear in the fact check, that's something that was put out a lot by conservative media that, yeah, look, there's this document that shows that she was a border czar, and it was from the Senate, but I think it was issued by, I'm going to make up a name. It was like a Marjorie Taylor Greene or someone like condemning her. So it's like, they could put in there that, Kamala Harris, the worst vice president in history. And that doesn't mean she was the worst vice president in history. It was just something that a senator put out as a potential vote. So disagree or agree that. Oh, do you want? Sorry, I interrupted as I started going. No, I was going to ask you if you agree or disagree. So yeah, I think we had some issues with the lag there in the audio.
I hear what you're saying. That might be possible. So 2 things out of that. One, the conservative media also claimed that she had never even gone to the border. And so part of my saying that she was shaking hands was then video surfaced of she was down there shaking hands with border guards on the border. So there was like plenty that was thrown around that I think was exaggerated or misinformation. And number 2, I do think that she didn't tackle that, but I think she should get some credit. There was a task force that was created to take on human trafficking out of that I think is worth noting, and maybe that was her focus. That's not to say that she shouldn't have addressed the border more head on if that was her duty. I don't know if that's the role of that, but I don't want to say also that like she was. I'm not going to take the blanket statement. She was border czar, and she failed. Like there was a lot more to that whole thing, and a lot more that came out of that than the press. I think once they're always trying to turn it into a soundbite. So if we're going for agree disagree, I'll say agree that maybe she was given that. Disagree that it was like it was termed like one, she was a do nothing, never showed up, and that nothing came out of it.
Yeah, and I mean, I hear you, but that's one of those things. If you look, there's an interview with Lester Holt, and I was actually going to try to pull it up here, but I'm not going to bore us with trying to find it. But it's worth checking out. There's an interview with Lester Holt, and this was from 2021, and he asks her, well, you're in charge of the border, and you haven't been to the border. And her response was a pretty terrible politics response. Well, yeah, but I haven't been to Europe either. What's your point? And that's something that you can look up, and I'll put a link on the website as well. But she clearly, and that's, again, I think over time she did go to the border. And I don't know. I didn't know she actually went to the border, but the initial attacks about her not being there were pretty clear. And that even was coming from someone like Lester Holt of NBC, who's clearly not a conservative media figure. So I hear you. Mm-hmm. I do think it's, when it comes down to it, I think the debate comes back to the role of the vice president. They're basically an ambassador. They're basically there they don't have any real official role. But if you tell someone you're in charge of the border, or you say that you're going to be helping the systemic causes to me, okay, well, what did you do to help? And I think that's the problem I have here. And I think step 1 would be to go to the border. And she clearly didn't do that. And that's something where, again, it just comes back to why. And I think that's something that's also been kind of thrown around behind the scenes, that maybe she hasn't worked very hard as a vice president, which is partially why some of the staff has left. They just haven't felt very energized by her. But it's also interesting because these rallies she's having now and the energy she's throwing out there is just night and day compared to what I've seen before. But I think my gut, and what if I'm doing a prediction on this show, is that we'll find out that she is a very, as someone who has worked on projects for school for a very long time and got everything done at the very last minute, but wraps up pretty well. I feel like she's kind of the same way, where she kind of puts things off for a very long time, and then it's like, oh, my time to shine. All right, let me get up on stage and give these great press conferences and get people fired up. But I don't see a lot of action in what she does. And so whether you think that's good or not is probably based on whether you think her policies are good, but I haven't really seen much of what she's done, especially at the border. So I don't know if we agreed on anything there, but
I don't know that we did. The last thing I'll throw in there is that I don't know I want to look that up when she went to the border. The interesting thing was, and I didn't know this, I was just researching this while obviously listening to you, but that there's a very famous meme where she says, do not come, right? She actually, that was in June of 2021 when she was in Guatemala. So she actually, my understanding is she didn't visit the border, actually went to the specific countries where a lot of those immigrants were coming. That's an interesting, we should hit that one too, Ray, of how the border or immigration crisis has changed over the years, because I think that at least up until a quick anecdote, up until I was selling my house and actually hired some folks legitimately to help me get it ready. And they were from Venezuela. I didn't realize that immigration of Mexicans has stopped almost completely since it's been a while. But the immigrants that are coming up through the border are coming from Guatemala, from Venezuela, from Bolivia. So it's interesting that, like, I'm going to say this from two white guys that came from Pennsylvania. We were all, it gets thrown around, oh, those Mexicans, right? Just to be very blunt. But it's really much more complex than that. It's a lot of Central America, top of South America. So I wouldn't say that she went behind the lines, so to speak, but I didn't realize that she had said that famous quote in Guatemala. So I don't think that we're going to agree on that one, but there.
Yeah. But I think going back to your point there, I think, again, a lot of people, it's kind of hiding her role and saying she really didn't have much to be in charge of. She said she was going to be in charge of root causes. She went to Guatemala. I think that backs up that point. And I agree with you, though. And I don't think there's no people from Mexico coming through, but it's not just from other countries. It's also from China and the Middle East and India. It's like, I mean, this really is an open border. And I think that's something that I think you and I think we agree on, that we need to have some reform in the immigration process, because what I get frustrated by, and I have a campaign slogan I'm going to give you, Ben, that I think would win a president on the border situation. Do you remember when Bill Clinton talked about abortion and said safe, legal, and rare?
Yeah.
Do you remember that famous
I think that was
description?
actually more Hillary, but yeah.
Either one. It was one of the Clintons. I know, I mean, I was still young and didn't really know what that meant, but yeah. I think if a president came out, whether they're Democrat or Republican, and said safe, legal, and fair, I think most people could get behind that from an immigration policy, because that's one of my big issues here, is that you want to have safety with it. You want to have legality to it, but it's also not fair, where I've met people and I have friends that came from Venezuela or came from Mexico, that there's one woman that I work with. I work with people with disabilities, and her son was getting treatment here, and she had been in America for 7 years, and her husband had been here for 2. It took 5 years for him to be reunited with his family because they did it the right way. And that to me is a huge flaw in the system. And if we don't fix those kind of flaws, we're not going to be able to fix the flow coming over the border. And on the flip side, the safety part of it, I don't think everyone coming over the border is a terrible human being, like some people might say. What I do think is, if we don't vet people and we don't have assimilation into society, that's going to be an issue for both the country and the people coming over the border. And so safe, legal, and fair to me is a way to have an immigration conversation that could actually lead to some results.
So when are you running? 2028, 2032?
Yeah, I think I'm
Your
gonna go
campaign
for
slogan there?
yeah. Well, I think at this point, there's no way possible I would ever want to run for president because, I mean, that's a whole nother issue too. But no good
Yeah.
people run for office other than never mind. No good people run for office. So I'm sure there's some people that have good traits and they usually don't go far. Let's say that people who are good people
Yeah.
don't go far in politics. So
Yeah,
anyway,
politicians are politicians.
yeah,
Gosh, I had one. Oh, so yeah, we're way off on a side tangent here. The one thing that I heard as a solution to this, that this is a whole nother episode we should do, right, for sure. But one thing I heard as a solution is to end the asylum, the instant, like the U.S. is one of the few countries in the world that gives instant asylum. It's sort of like you have an asylum until proven otherwise. And
right.
that's actually what fuels a lot of this is folks come over the border and say, oh, I'm claiming asylum, which they can do from Venezuela, for instance, because of the political landscape there. But it does make it that it makes it very easy for someone to claim asylum and then sort of set up here, their life here, waiting for an overcrowded court system to process their case. And so that's one of the potential quick wins to your campaign slogan there.
Well, you know who did that
fair.
though, Ben? Yeah. I mean, it's funny that the person who's more liberal on this brings up a Trump era policy of remain in Mexico. Did you look into remain in Mexico much?
Not a lot. No.
Basically, it's what you just said. Instead of basically what happens now with immigration is that someone comes over the border and they're free. They say, oh, I'm seeking asylum. You go out. They don't necessarily have a way to track them. It's just they can go wherever they want in the country. And you can claim asylum for all kinds of things. And there's no way to really back that up because the agencies in America aren't necessarily working with Guatemala, Venezuela, especially places like Venezuela. And Trump had a remain in Mexico policy where, okay, you want to claim asylum? Great. Stay over in Mexico until we process it. And that goes back to the issue of fairness and timeliness where we were overburdened. So there were a lot of people waiting in Mexico. But in August of 2022, Biden ended that, and that's actually when we saw a lot of the increase in that. So I agree with you, and that's one of those things with at the time when Trump put that policy into place, it was considered racist and terrible, and it was separating families. And I don't know if you remember the famous scene when AOC went down to the border and she had all those cameras and she was crying, and then you saw the angles and she was actually really, really far away. But it's you should look it up. I'll put a link in the site. But that was I think a good policy. But the problem with that policy
versus Melania visiting the border and had that coat that said, "I don't care, do you?" Do you remember that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of those. Like, yeah, I mean, these are any time a politician does any of those stage things. We've talked about this before. Those stupid whiteboards they have in Congress. It just annoys me to no end. Not only are we paying for those stupid whiteboards, which are very expensive, by the way, and us as taxpayers are paying for them. They're doing it just for press. They're not really trying to have a discussion. So yes, I agree with you, but that is something that we should have a bigger discussion on in the future because, I mean, if we get into immigration, that could be a 17-part episode, and I do want to do that at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would be interested in digging into that one more. And there's some timing with the Trump stuff that I think, he claims more of credit than he should for. But on the face value of what you just said, I may agree with that. Sort of the wait in Mexico situation. So, and then there's Obama, who was, no one wanted to talk about it on the Democrat side, but had the highest
deportation
rate of any modern president. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it's
back
one of
to
those
the
things.
Vice President.
Yes, back to the Vice President. I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to wrap up by saying I think that's one of the things where every person. It's like when the stuff hits the fan, what do you actually do with it? It's really good to talk in platitudes when you're running for office, and that's both sides of the aisle. But then you get in office and you're like, oh no, we have to manage this. I guess I'm going to have to go against what my views were in the run up to the election. And that's where I care most about the policies. And going back to the vice president, I think that's something that with Kamala Harris, I'm still very confused about what her policies actually are, because she was very progressive. Now she's saying she's not. She's picking a progressive candidate on the side. But I don't know. I think that at this point, I think both of the presidents have picked poor VP candidates, but I don't think it matters too much because I think at this point, really, no one's going to go, you know what, I was going to vote for Trump, but JD Vance steered me away from it. No one's going to go, oh, you know what, I liked Kamala Harris and I can't stand Donald Trump, but that Tim Walz guy, he's too old, so I'm going to go switch to Trump. Like, I just don't think that's going to happen. I think the two candidates at the top have enough personality and support that's built in that isn't going to swing the votes. And so I don't see a lot of changes there. But what I do hope for the future, I think this is, we've talked about the historical role of the vice president. We've talked about some of the modern roles here. I think the VP role for me, I think I would love to see it go back to a time of someone like, I'm looking at someone like George H.W. Bush, who actually had some good policies and plans and seemed like a diplomat and could work behind the scenes. And I think for you, last episode, you talked about Mike Pence, whether you agree with his policies or not, the fact that he didn't stop counting the electoral votes, he cared about the Constitution first. I think having someone who isn't just another attack dog, having someone who can actually be an administrator, can try to work behind the scenes to get things done, and you can actually count on as a good human being, I think is what I want to get back to as our future roles for vice presidents.
Yeah. I do think, I would say that Walz so far seems like a good human being, almost too good to be true, right? Like they're really painting him as like teacher, coach, everybody loves him kind of thing. And I'm like, just waiting to find out something terrible. It's like waiting for the shoe to drop. We'll see what happens. But yeah, the VP role has always been symbolic until maybe more recent years. So we should talk about the evolution of that. So when we started this it started as two opposing candidates, which is really wild. I can see it's sort of like the good intentions. Like I'd see why the forefathers did it. They're like, we don't want a king, and we don't want a king so much that we're going to make him work with his political opponent.
Get in a room and solve it yourself.
That's right. Sounds great in theory. Doesn't work out so well in practice. To where there was a few constitutional amendments to make them, as we were saying before, that they became the pick of the president and was aligned with the president and an advocate for the president. And it started as an empty office, as Adam said initially. So you're sort of starting from a pretty low level to begin with, to where historically, I know we were talking about a few VPs that then took over after the president became incapacitated or died or whatever. So one that we both really love is Teddy Roosevelt. We actually do agree that Teddy Roosevelt was one of the best presidents. Any others that you want to touch on? Also, I remember before that it was one presidential wife that took over.
Yes. Well, Ben, sort of you're getting into into my fun facts for the end of the podcast, because I do have a few fun facts about the VP. So let's hold off for now.
I'll save it to the lightning round. The
lightning round. I think, basically to me, two of the biggest secession points were Andrew Johnson, which obviously that was Lincoln. And what's interesting, because we talk about having people from different political parties going against each other. And at the time of Lincoln, that wasn't the case, but because you had a running mate, but he chose a running mate in Andrew Johnson who was from a different political party, which is pretty interesting. So there were a lot of disagreements there, but he was running under basically a unity system. And so he wanted to really bring the country together, which is another great thing about Abraham Lincoln. And so he picked someone with different views, but that was actually the first time that the vice president acceded to presidency. John Tyler was. John Tyler in 1841, but the Andrew Johnson was the first time where it was assassination. So depending on which way you want to go with, but I think the Andrew Johnson was more important because you just had the Civil War, you had differing parties, and in comes Andrew Johnson, and I think it was a pretty big shock to the country in a lot of ways at that point. So him and Teddy Roosevelt, I think, to me, were the two biggest VP ascensions, where if you look back, they actually had different policies, or in Teddy Roosevelt's case, he was just such a good president. He really picked up the slack from his running mate there. So McKinley, I don't know, really, I don't know. You look back at historical presidents, he falls a bit lower in the list.
Yeah, I would add Truman and more recently Ford.
Yeah.
Maybe because it's more recent, and Truman just because of there was sort of World War II implications and things like that after FDR. But and then Ford, that was just really fascinating, was the amount of, because I think it was Agnew was Nixon's VP. He dropped out. I can't remember how that worked. And then Ford became his VP, and then Ford then became president when Nixon resigned. And then who did Ford pick? Was that Reagan?
No.
That
Reagan,
was like this.
Nelson Rockefeller? Nelson
Oh,
Rockefeller.
Rockefeller. That's right. That's right. It was
Yeah.
Rockefeller.
He's the guy that has that center up in New York City. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. So, yes. I don't know if the Rockefeller family rings a bell, but
yeah. Oh, yeah, Jay-Z, right? I think.
yeah,
No,
yes. One thing I'll say,
right.
just to kind of wrap up some of the vice presidents in history. Actually, I think someone I have a collection of historical autographs, and one that I have is Gerald Ford, and there's a reason why I have an autograph of him. Bob Woodworth, the one who broke the Watergate story, and really came hard after Nixon, and Gerald Ford especially, because Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. And that's probably the last time, the pardoning of Richard Nixon from Gerald Ford is the last time I saw a president do something that was so self-sabotaging but was good for the country. At the time, Woodward said that, this is terrible. He shouldn't be pardoned. He should go to jail. He should feel the full force of the law. And over time, he actually came out and said, I was wrong on that. Gerald Ford did the right thing. What the country needed at that point was healing. And Gerald Ford knew that was going to kill his career, but he knew it was what was good for the country. At least, again, I don't know people's motivations, but that's what I get out of it from the research I've done into it. And I think he actually did that from a purely loving perspective of the country. He loved the country, wanted to make sure that the Union stayed strong. And I can't think of a time since where someone was so self-sacrificial as a president, because everyone wants to hold on to the office for so long. They don't want to give it up. I mean, you can talk about Biden being nearly, he should have been gone a long time ago, but he held on to it, wanted to run for election again when he clearly wasn't fit.
Mm-hmm.
You look at Trump and everything that happened after the election, and with, the Mike Pence stuff. But that to me was the last time self-sacrificial.
Well, I would argue that Biden stepping down and not running, for re-election is up there.
I think that's a Nancy Pelosi sacrifice more than Joe Biden sacrifice. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how much Pelosi had to do with it or not. I mean, yeah, speaking of term limits, right, we were talking about last time. But, in terms of power players, I do think, again, that's very rare that sorry if you hear bells in the background. I'm in Spain right now, actually. I guess I'll drop that. It's kind of
now you make me do some extra
cool
editing here in the podcast. Yeah, we'll just.
Oh yeah, you don't want people to know that I live a luxurious life internationally. No, just kidding.
Yeah. All right,
that's not true. No, I was just saying that because you're going to hear bells, which sometimes there's a little too many bells going on at the same time. Like all the churches, I think, are like vying for it, but for loudest bell ringer. But anyway, back to the matter at hand. Yeah, I would say what Ford did. I mean, I think it would be more so if it was Carter doing it, right? Because it's a president from the other party. I think Ford's. You don't know how it would have turned out had he gone on trial, had Nixon gone on trial, et cetera. I think at the end of the day, you're trying to prevent. I don't know that a civil war would have broken out per se, but that's the worst case scenario, right?
Yeah, I mean, this wasn't current politics, but it was definitely going to be a huge divide in the country.
Sure. So, but I'm going to put Biden up there. I agree, he should have done it sooner, but I think Trump should not have rerun either. So, I think anyone who is able to call it and say, and he could have pulled any one of those, he could have pulled a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? Who everyone told her retire, and then she did not, and she died in office, and then Trump was able to fill that seat. And if you're for conservative justices, it was a win. If you're for more liberal justices, it was a loss. So I think anyone who knows when to call it, some of our elder states people, Congress people should take note. But I'm still gonna credit Biden with that versus,
I'm going to give him like 5% credit. I hear you, and I'm with you. Here's what I'm with you 100% on. We should have more people retiring, but they won't. I mean, whether it's president, whether it's Congress, they're not going to give up that power. We should have more people resigning, like George Washington, saying, hey, my time is up. Let's get someone else in there. I don't think that was Biden. And again, I don't think we're going to agree on this. I don't think we need to belabor the point, but I think it was more of what was behind the scenes, because he was in public very clear about the fact that he was still running, and whether that was him, whether it was his family pushing him forward, whatever it was, he was very clear about it. And I think having Obama, Axelrod, Pelosi, everyone else come out in public, and whatever else went on behind the scenes, I think there's a lot that we don't see. So I hear you. I respectfully disagree. I don't think it really was Biden that did that. I think he was the one that signed the paperwork, but I think, and that doesn't mean that someone forced to, just to be clear to listeners, I'm not saying there's some conspiracy and he was forced to do it, but it was one of those pressures of, hey man, this is time and we're all against you at this point. But to not end on a down note, I want to give some fun facts, Ben. Are you ready for some rapid fire fun facts to wrap up the episode?
Let's do it.
I know you love fun facts. I'm going to see if there's some of these I think you'll pretty easily get. And some of these are just random because, as we've talked about before, VPs are pretty forgettable generally. But do you know who the first VP was? I'm going to give you an easy one because we already talked about him.
It was Adams, wasn't it?
Correct. And again, that quote was, the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. But then he became the second president, so I guess he moved up into a better office. And this one is made famous by a play. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. It's near that Rockefeller place, the Hamilton. They had this play. Who was the VP that dueled Alexander Hamilton and killed him?
Aaron Burr.
Aaron Burr.
Is that right?
At Aaron Burr. Yeah. You're 2 for 2. And
Hamilton,
this
he's a great rapper.
Yes, exactly. This one I'm not even going to ask you because I forgot this guy was a VP, but there's 2 interesting facts about him. We talk about the most tie-breaking votes in the Senate. So when the VP has to go and break a tie, if you have a 4-year, what do you think the number of most tie-breaking votes was? Let me go with that. Just give me a range. What do you think the most tie-breaking votes by any vice president was?
In a 4-year period?
I think he had 8 years, actually.
I was going to say 10. I'm going to say 20. I don't know.
31 by John C. Calhoun, who served as vice president under both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. 31. So it actually does have some more power than I thought.
Yeah. Back then, when Congress was actually passing legislation.
Yep. Exactly. I'm going to finish up with 2 more. The first one is, who was the only vice president who was sworn in on foreign soil? And if you get this one, Ben, I am $1,000. I'm not a gambler. I'm not a bettor, but you'll just never get this one unless you Google it on the side.
My first thought was it's not him. I thought it was going to be LBJ. But he was on an airplane when it happened.
That's a very good guess. Yeah. It was William Rufus Devane King, who was vice president for 45 days under Franklin Pierce. Yeah, who was another president you always forget about, in 1853. And he was in Cuba, of all places. So the only vice president to be sworn in on foreign soil was Cuba. But he had, I think, some kind of lung disease and was dying, and they served him, or they, swore him in, and then all of a sudden he died. But the last one, Ben, and I think you probably know the answer to this because we were talking about it before, but who was the first female vice president?
So I don't remember who it was. That's why I was asking before, and I'm not I'm not going to betray myself and do a search. I would have said, here's my guess, but I already know the true. I would have said that it was Roosevelt's wife. But that's not right because Truman took over after.
Yeah, it would have been a great guess. And you're talking about FDR, not Teddy
FDR.
Roosevelt.
Yeah.
So it was
No,
actually
poor Teddy, his wife. Oh man, what a sad life. Anyway.
So for listeners, basically Kamala Harris was officially the first female vice president. So she was the first. But Edith Bowling Galt Wilson was the second wife of Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow, yeah.
She was the first lady from 1915 to 1921, and he had a severe stroke in 1919. And this is actually from whitehouse.gov. But she pre-screened all matters of state and functionally ran the executive branch of government for the remainder of Wilson's second term. So actually, she was probably the first female president, if we're getting down to it. But it was only a ceremonial role. I have no idea how you would actually classify that. But Kamala Harris the first, Edith Bowling Galt Wilson was the first one who kind of ran the country that we know of. Maybe Martha was doing stuff with George, but that's the first we knew of.
Well, in the spirit of research the news, now I'm going to research that time when she was president to see
interesting.
If she was actually what she was doing, how effective it was, et cetera. It'd be really fascinating to see the implications of that. So that's my research.
All right. I wonder when the 15th Amendment was passed. Or not the 15th Amendment. Which one was the right to vote for women?
25th? You think?
25th.
Oh, the women's suffrage.
19th Amendment.
No, 25th was
25th.
Yeah. The 25th was
19th
the
Amendment,
one where
women's
the
right
vice
to
takes
vote.
over under capacitors. Yeah.
Let's see when that was actually passed. That was
that was
passed
1912, 19. Gosh.
1919. Ooh. That was proposed in 1919, which was right in the heart of when she was in office. It's interesting. I don't think there's any correlation, but now that you bring it up, that's a challenge to all the listeners and for you, Ben, and for myself. We need to find the trail that leads to Edith Bowling Galt Wilson incorporating the 19th Amendment into the Constitution. We'll see if we found something new and research the news.
Interesting. Yeah. That could all it could be just have all worked together at the right time in the right place.
Yeah.
Interesting. How this works.
Crazy how this stuff comes together. All right, Ben, anything else you want to cover before we wrap up?
No, I think we did. I think we officially researched the news on this episode and have further research ahead of us.
You didn't think you were going to listen. Dear listeners, you didn't think you were going to listen to a podcast and not get homework, right? Yeah, we have now homework. So tell all your friends about the podcast that gives you homework. I actually never thought about that before, but I think that's our new tagline, Ben. The podcast that gives you homework. So
yeah, I think people will come in droves and listen. They're like, "Oh, my life's not busy."
Yeah, well, you're the marketing guy, Ben. I'm the guy who likes the researching, and you're the marketer. So you got to take my terrible ideas and turn them into something palatable for the general population. So that's how we have to work it here.
Yeah. Either
all right,
that,
Ben.
I'm like the marketer tells the CEO, like, "That's not a great idea." Yeah. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. All right, Ben. I think this was a fun discussion. I learned something. I learned a few things. I learned a bunch of things. I appreciate the conversation. And I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with the rest of this election cycle with VPs. And I'm hoping that our discussion will lead to a better future for the VP role. I hope someone listens to this and says, you know what? All of the immigration issues we have, they're solved by Ray's talking point right there. And I think that when we talk about having discussions with each other, I hope politicians read this and change who they are. So I doubt that's going to happen, but that's my hope.
In the meantime, it's enjoyable to do it, Ray. So
I just enjoy the conversation. So I hope that you do as well, listeners. Feel free to check us out on researchthenews.com, and we'll be back with another episode soon.